Ethan Mallory was the kind of man who disappeared into the background of his own life without anyone noticing. A 40-year-old insurance claims adjuster in Cincinnati who lived alone in a second-floor apartment that always smelled faintly of damp wood and leftover coffee grounds. He told himself that routine was safety, that the sameness of his life was what kept him grounded. But in truth, each day felt like trudging through water, heavy and sluggish, with no destination worth reaching. He would wake at 6, brew a pot of cheap supermarket coffee that left a sour film in his mouth, scroll through endless spreadsheets under the humming fluorescent lights of the office, and return to his apartment with its peeling wallpaper and windows fogged by condensation. Friends had drifted away long ago, and the few colleagues who remembered he existed thought of him as the quiet, pale man who always said he was fine. On a rainy Tuesday evening in early March, Ethan sat slouched at his desk, the sound of dripping water echoing from the kitchen sink. He rubbed his temple, feeling the usual dull ache that came after hours of staring at numbers, when a strange itch tugged at the inside of his left ear. At first it was small, like the brush of a hair or the tickle of dust, but as his finger traced the rim of his ear and pressed slightly inside, he felt something solid, a tender swelling just beyond the reach of his nail. He grimaced, muttering, "Great, a zit, just what I need," and tried to laugh it off. But as he pressed against it, the sensation was not the sharp sting of a typical pimple. Instead, the flesh felt hot and oddly firm, as though something beneath the skin were throbbing gently in its own rhythm. He shrugged it off, attributing it to stress or maybe an ingrown hair, and went to bed listening to the steady patter of rain against the glass. But sleep came fitfully, disturbed by vague, clammy dreams where his ear seemed to grow larger and larger, distending grotesquely as whispers rose inside his head. He woke at 3 in the morning with his pillow damp from sweat and a faint, irritating throb inside his ear that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. Sitting on the edge of his bed in the dim glow of the street lamp outside, Ethan slipped his pinky finger inside his ear again and felt the lump. It was bigger now, unmistakably larger than it had been just hours before, a firm knot of tissue pressing outward, tender and raw. He hissed and jerked his finger away, wiping a faint smear of moisture onto the bedsheet. His stomach churned with unease, but he told himself it was nothing, just a bad pimple. People got those all the time. The next morning, at work, Ethan kept tilting his head slightly to one side, trying to relieve the dull ache that had set in. The hum of the office lights felt louder than usual, the shuffle of papers sharper, as though every sound funneled directly into his left ear. A colleague, a younger woman named Cheryl, leaned over his desk at one point and asked, "You okay? You look kind of pale." Ethan forced a weak smile and said, "Didn't sleep well, that's all." He didn't mention the pressure inside his ear, the strange feeling that the lump was pushing deeper, threading into his skull. By mid-afternoon, the discomfort had grown unbearable. He excused himself to the bathroom, locking the stall door behind him, and angled his phone's flashlight into the mirror. Tilting his head, he pulled his ear outward and gasped softly. Inside the canal, partially visible through the pink folds of flesh, was a swollen, angry mass the size of a pea, stretched taut and glossy. The skin around it was discolored, mottled red and gray, and as he stared he swore he saw it quiver ever so slightly, as though something within shifted against its casing. His stomach turned and he looked away, gripping the sink until his knuckles whitened. "It's just an infection," he muttered. "I'll call a clinic tomorrow." But tomorrow never seemed to come in a normal way. That night, alone in his apartment with the radiator clanking and the air damp, Ethan sat on the couch trying not to touch his ear. Yet every few minutes his hand would drift upward involuntarily, fingers brushing the side of his head as though to confirm it was still there, still growing. The television played some rerun sitcom laugh track, but the sound seemed warped, echoing strangely in his left ear, as if the mass inside distorted every vibration. At one point, during a particularly sharp burst of laughter from the canned audience, Ethan flinched violently, pressing his palms to his ears, because the noise had come not only from outside but also from within, reverberating through his skull like someone knocking on the walls of his mind. When he finally stumbled to the bathroom again and turned on the harsh light, what he saw made him grip the edge of the sink to keep from collapsing. The lump had doubled in size, protruding farther into view, the stretched skin glistening with a thin sheen of fluid that smelled faintly metallic, like rust or blood mixed with wet pennies. He leaned closer, trembling, and thought he saw tiny lines within the mass, faint striations like the veins of a leaf, and they pulsed faintly in time with his heart. A wave of nausea crashed through him and he backed away, shutting off the light, refusing to look further. He wrapped himself in a blanket on the couch and tried to sleep, but every time he began to drift off he was pulled awake by the sensation of something shifting inside his ear, a subtle crackling like paper being crumpled in slow motion. Over the next days, Ethan's life began to unravel. He wore his hood up even indoors, trying to conceal how his left ear had started to swell outward slightly, the skin around it reddened and tender. At work he avoided conversations, answering emails with curt one-word replies. The throbbing ache grew sharper, at times sending stabbing jolts down his jaw into his throat. Once, during a meeting, he caught himself pressing his pen so hard into his palm that it left puncture marks, simply to distract himself from the crawling sensation in his ear. On Thursday afternoon, after leaving the office early, he sat in his car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his hands went numb. The world outside felt blurred, indistinct, as if he were seeing it through a fogged window. The lump inside his ear was no longer just a lump. He could feel it moving when he tilted his head, as though it had grown roots, thin tendrils threading into the soft tissue. That night, unable to resist, he pressed a Q-tip carefully into his ear, hoping to ease the pressure or draw out some pus. As the cotton brushed against the swollen mass, Ethan's entire body convulsed in revulsion. The growth twitched violently beneath the touch, a spasmodic shiver like a muscle contracting, and a wet sound issued from it, an unmistakable soft pop, followed by a trickle of thick, grayish fluid that reeked of burnt plastic and metal. He gagged and stumbled back, dropping the Q-tip onto the tiled floor, where it left a smear like old grease. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He wiped his hand against his shirt, but the smell clung stubbornly, sour and acrid, making his eyes water. He scrubbed at the sink for 10 minutes afterward, but even as he washed the filth away, the sensation remained, the knowledge that something inside him had twitched of its own accord. Ethan called in sick the next morning, his voice hoarse as he lied about having the flu. He sat at home with the blinds closed, shivering though the air was warm. His phone buzzed occasionally with texts from his supervisor asking for updates, but he ignored them. He spent hours pacing, then hours collapsed on the couch, pressing a heating pad to his ear. Sometimes the pad's warmth seemed to soothe the throbbing, but more often it made the growth ache more intensely, pulsing like a living thing irritated by the heat. He tried to eat soup, but the smell of it mixed nauseatingly with a metallic tang that seemed permanently lodged in his nostrils. He gagged and dumped the bowl in the sink. By late afternoon, a headache clawed through the left side of his skull, and every sound seemed distorted. The low rumble of traffic outside the window came in waves that seemed to vibrate through the mass in his ear, almost as though it were resonating like a drum. That evening, Ethan finally summoned the courage to look again. He propped a mirror on the sink, angled a lamp toward his face, and slowly pulled his ear back. The sight made bile rise in his throat. The mass now filled nearly half the canal, bulging outward, its glossy surface streaked with faint dark veins. And as he stared, he saw it move. Not a trick of his eyes, not the pulse of blood, but a deliberate shudder, a ripple traveling across its surface like something inside pressing against the walls, seeking release. His vision swam and he clutched the counter, dry heaving. When he raised his head again, panting, he noticed that the faint crackling he'd been hearing was no longer distant. It was louder now, crisp and close, like brittle twigs snapping underfoot, and it was coming unmistakably from within his ear. He backed away from the mirror, trembling, whispering to himself, "It's not real, it's just infection, it's just infection." He tried to convince himself that tomorrow he would call a doctor, make an appointment, let someone professional deal with it. But as he sat alone in the darkened living room, listening to the rain spatter against the windows, the pressure inside his ear mounted until tears welled in his eyes. He pressed the heels of his hands against both ears, trying to drown out the noise, but that only made it worse. Because in the muffled silence he created, he realized the sound wasn't merely crackling, it was rhythmic. It was breathing. Something inside his ear was drawing in air, exhaling faintly, as though learning to use his body as its own chamber. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body rigid, the blanket slipping from his lap as he stared wide-eyed into the dark. And then, faint and wet and unmistakably deliberate, came the next sound, a soft, rasping whisper that seemed to vibrate not in the room but inside his own skull, curling directly into his thoughts, a single word that made his blood run cold: "Ethan." The night after he first noticed the strange pressure in his ear, the man lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind running in restless circles because he could no longer convince himself it was just a fleeting irritation, no longer just a small itch or dull soreness that might fade after a day. It had grown into something heavier, pulsing like a hidden heartbeat lodged inside the folds of his ear, and the thought of it kept him from sleep, kept him turning on the bed, pressing his head. against the pillow one way then the other, hoping the pressure would disperse, but it only grew worse, as though the pillow itself was amplifying the sensation, making him hear his own blood rushing against the strange growth. By morning the pain was sharper, almost like someone pinching a nerve just beneath the skin, and when he stumbled into the bathroom mirror to check, he was horrified to see that the small blemish he thought might be a harmless pimple had swelled into a raised red mound at the entrance of his ear canal, bulging outward as if something inside was desperate to push its way out, the skin stretched and shiny, tender even to the lightest touch. He tried not to panic, tried to steady his breath as he leaned closer, twisting his head to see better, but the sight unsettled him. The bump was far too large for just overnight swelling, a kind of angry boil that made his entire ear look swollen and misshapen, and when he pressed the skin near it, a sharp sting ran through his jaw and down the side of his neck. He stepped back, clutching the edge of the sink, fighting the sudden dizziness that came over him, and he told himself not to make it worse by fiddling with it, that maybe it was just a bad infection, that he should leave it alone, yet the temptation gnawed at him because the pressure inside begged to be released, like something caged beneath the thin surface. He went about his day distracted, unable to focus on work, each sound muffled in that ear as though cotton had been stuffed inside, every vibration echoing strangely, and by the afternoon he began to hear a faint ringing, a high whine like an old television left on in another room. He tried to shake it off, but as evening drew near the discomfort sharpened into pain again, a deep ache that spread into his temple and even made chewing his dinner unbearable. He skipped eating, sat in the dark with a hand pressed to his head, rocking slightly, muttering to himself that it was just a pimple, just a stupid blemish, yet deep down he felt something was not right, something about the speed of its growth, the way it seemed to alter his hearing and his sense of balance. It was wrong in a way that made his skin crawl. At midnight he couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and stood in front of the mirror again, pulling at his ear, shining the light into the canal, and what he saw froze him. The swollen lump had developed a dark center, not like the small black dot of a clogged pore but a strange slit, as though the skin itself was beginning to tear open, revealing something beneath, a line of deep red, moist and trembling slightly as if it moved on its own. His stomach turned, bile rising in his throat, and he nearly dropped the flashlight, but he forced himself to look closer, heart pounding, his breath fogging the mirror, and then he saw the faintest twitch inside the slit, a movement that was not his own, a shiver that made him stagger backward. He collapsed onto the toilet lid, clutching his head, whispering no, 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 because this was not a pimple, not an infection, not anything he could explain. It was something alive or trying to become alive, and the idea of that burrowed into his chest like ice water. He thought about calling a doctor, but then the shame and fear tangled together. What could he say? What words would not make him sound insane? And besides, he hated hospitals, hated the cold rooms and sharp smells, so he convinced himself he could endure one more night, that he would decide in the morning. But the night was long and full of terror. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the pulsing in his ear, a rhythm that did not match his heartbeat, like a second life forming in his flesh, and in the silence he swore he heard faint scratching, a sound too real to be imagined. When dawn finally came, he dragged himself out of bed with hollow eyes and trembling hands, and in the mirror the growth was worse, his ear grotesquely misshapen, the slit wider, glistening with some clear fluid, and deep inside he thought he glimpsed something pale, something that reflected the light back at him. He gagged and stumbled away, knocking over a glass from the sink, watching it shatter on the tile, but he couldn't bring himself to clean it, couldn't bring himself to touch anything except his ear. The rest of the day he hid in his apartment, curtains drawn, pacing in circles, groaning with every wave of pain, unable to escape the sound inside his head, which had grown louder, no longer just a ringing but a faint series of clicks, like the tapping of fingernails on glass, rhythmic and deliberate. He pressed his palms against both ears, but the sound came from within, unstoppable, and with every click his vision seemed to blur, as though his brain itself vibrated with the noise. By evening he realized he had been bleeding. Dried streaks ran down his neck, and when he touched them his fingers came away sticky, yet there was no scab, no healing, only the raw oozing of the strange slit in his ear, widening by the hour. At one point, delirious, he thought he saw something small and segmented twitch just inside, retreating quickly when he screamed and shoved his finger near, though he dared not touch it. He lost track of time, lost track of meals, lost track of the line between waking and dream, because every time he shut his eyes he saw the slit open wider, saw it split into a mouth, saw teeth glistening inside, and when he snapped awake and sweat the pain in his ear convinced him it was no dream. By the third night he could not lie down anymore, the swelling pressed too sharply, so he sat in a chair, rocking, moaning, his eyes darting to every shadow because he felt watched, felt as though whatever lived inside him was aware, growing more aware with each passing moment. He tried to call his sister at one point, clutching the phone, desperate to tell someone. But when she answered he froze, because he realized the sounds coming from his own throat were not words, only garbled croaks and half-screams, as though his voice was no longer his to control, and when she kept saying his name, panic rising, he hung up, threw the phone across the room, and sobbed until his body gave out. Somewhere deep inside he knew that the growth was no ordinary infection, that it was not random, that it had purpose, and with every throb of pain he imagined it feeding, pulling energy from his body, turning him into something else, and by then the thought of a doctor seemed useless, laughable, because he was already too far gone, his ear no longer human, his flesh no longer his own. And as the fourth night fell, he sat trembling in the dark, waiting for the moment when whatever lived beneath his skin would finally push its way out, praying that he might not live to see it happen, yet terrified that he would. The man could not sleep that night, no matter how many times he turned over in bed, no matter how tightly he pressed the pillow against his head in hopes of dulling the throbbing pain that now radiated from inside his left ear like a living thing trying to break free. It started as a mild discomfort, a pressure that could have been mistaken for wax build-up or perhaps a minor infection, but by midnight it had turned into something monstrous, a swelling presence that seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart, pushing against the cartilage, stretching the skin, and whispering in his nerves that something far worse than an ordinary boil had chosen him as its host. And as he stumbled into the bathroom to look at himself in the mirror, he froze at the sight of the grotesque bulge forming along the side of his ear canal, red and angry, glossy with an oily sheen, as if the skin itself could barely contain whatever writhed beneath it, and he felt panic rising in his chest, choking him, because he knew deep inside that this was no random blemish, no natural infection, but a continuation of the strange, cursed series of events that had begun when he wandered too far into the forest that afternoon when he should have gone straight home. His reflection stared back at him, pale and drawn, beads of sweat dripping down his temple, the ear grotesquely distorted by the boil that had grown in a matter of hours, and he heard himself whispering, "What is happening to me?" Though there was no one in the silent house to answer him, only the faint buzzing sound that seemed to come from inside his skull, a high-pitched frequency that was not quite sound but more like static directly injected into his mind, and he gripped the sink to steady himself, feeling light-headed, as the boil throbbed again, harder, as though whatever was inside had responded to his question, as though it was alive, listening, waiting. He staggered backward, clutching his head, and sat on the floor, trembling, his mind racing through every possibility. Should he call a doctor, rush to the emergency room, or would that only expose him further? Would they see something in his ear that they could not explain, something that would make them keep him under observation or worse, report him? Because he could not shake the memory of the shadowy figures he thought he had glimpsed near the edge of the woods, men who vanished the moment he looked twice, as though they had been watching him, waiting for this very development. And now he was trapped, sitting on the bathroom floor with pain tearing through his skull and the overwhelming certainty that his body was no longer entirely his own. The boil pressed outward with a grotesque force, the skin stretching so tightly it looked ready to split, and his breathing quickened, his eyes darting wildly across the tiles as if looking for an escape route from his own body, and then he felt it, a tiny, sharp movement from inside the boil, like a needle scratching against the edge of his flesh, and he screamed, clutching his ear, because there was no denying it any more. Something was moving inside him, shifting, pushing, testing the barrier of his skin, and he stumbled to his feet, knocking over a glass on the counter that shattered on the tiles, the sound echoing like gunfire in the silence of the night, and he ran to the kitchen, half blinded by pain and panic, fumbling through drawers until he found a small knife, gripping it with shaking hands as he staggered back to the bathroom mirror, his reflection now monstrous, the ear swollen and grotesque, the boil quivering slightly as though mocking him, and he raised the blade, breathing hard, muttering to himself, "I have to get it out, I have to get it out." But as the cold steel touched his skin, another surge of movement jolted through the boil and a sudden wave of dizziness crashed over him, his vision blurring, the buzzing in his head rising into a deafening roar. And he dropped the knife, clutching his temples as if his skull would split open, collapsing once more to the floor. When he awoke, he was lying in a puddle of his own sweat, the knife glinting near his hand. But the boil had not burst, it had grown larger, more defined, and the skin around it was now marked with faint, branching lines like black veins spreading outward, crawling toward his jaw and temple. And he realized in horror that whatever lived inside was expanding, taking root, spreading its influence further into his body, and he could not stop shaking, muttering broken fragments of prayers and curses, because he knew this was only the beginning. And as he sat there in the silence, the house suddenly creaked, a sound from the hallway, and he froze, holding his breath, because he knew he had locked the doors and shut the windows, and yet the soft sound of footsteps came closer, deliberate, slow, as though someone or something had entered while he was writhing on the floor. And the last thought that chilled his blood before the bathroom light flickered and went out was not of escape or survival, but the realization that maybe he had been chosen for this, that whatever had started in the woods was now inside him, and the people who had been watching from the shadows would soon return, not to save him, but to claim what was theirs. And the boil in his ear pulsed again, this time not just with pain but with a faint, unmistakable rhythm that was not his heartbeat at all, but something foreign, steady, growing stronger with every passing second. The fourth night was unlike the others because he no longer recognized the difference between his body and the thing that had made a home inside his ear, the boil that had grown larger and darker until it consumed not just the side of his face but also his sense of identity, and he stood in front of the mirror trembling, drenched in sweat, staring at the grotesque swelling that had distorted his ear into something unrecognizable. The skin stretched until it looked translucent, and beneath the glossy surface something writhed and shifted as if impatient to be born, and he could not look away because every time it moved he felt it in his jaw, in his throat, even in his chest, a resonance that told him it was no longer just confined to the ear but spreading, connecting to nerves and tissues, colonizing him from the inside, and his mind screamed to cut it out, yet his body would not obey. His hands shook so violently that the knife he gripped slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, and he dropped to his knees to retrieve it, but the dizziness hit him again, the loud static in his skull roaring until he thought his eardrum might burst, and then he heard it for the first time. Not static, not random clicking, but a pattern, a rhythm of syllables whispered in a language he did not understand yet somehow recognized in his bones, ancient and commanding, and as the boil pulsed in time with those words, he realized with gut-chilling certainty that it was speaking through him, that it was using his body as an antenna, that the whispers he heard inside his skull were not madness but communication, and he stumbled backward, hitting the wall, clutching his head as tears streamed down his face, begging it to stop, but it did not. The whispers grew louder, synchronized with the quivering mass in his ear until the surface split for the first time and a thin line of blood trickled down his neck, warm and sticky, and he screamed but no one heard him because his phone lay shattered on the floor where he had thrown it the night before, and the city outside went on oblivious while inside this small apartment something unspeakable was happening, something that should not exist, and as he stared into the mirror with wide unblinking eyes he saw the slit widen further, tearing through the swollen flesh, and from within came a clear viscous fluid that dripped in slow strands onto his shoulder, carrying with it a smell like iron mixed with decay, and deep inside the slit something pale shifted, a shape with tiny ridges that flexed and pulled back as though testing the air, and he gagged, bile rising in his throat, but he could not look away, could not deny what he saw, because in that instant it was clear. The thing inside was alive, not infection or abscess but a creature, growing, waiting, and his body was merely the shell it had chosen, and as that realization burned through him the footsteps returned, the same slow, deliberate steps in the hallway that he had heard the night before, and he froze, knife in hand, sweat dripping into his eyes, because this time the steps did not fade but came closer, stopping just outside the bathroom door, and a voice spoke his name, calm and low, the voice of his sister though he knew she could not be here. She lived across the city and he had not told her his address, yet the voice was perfect, familiar, soothing, and it said, "It's time, open the door," and the boil in his ear throbbed in agreement, pulsing so violently that his vision swam, and he shook his head, pressing his back against the door, muttering no, 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 but the voice came again, sharper now, commanding, and the whispers in his skull merged with it until he could no longer tell whether the sound came from outside or inside, and when the doorknob began to turn he let out a strangled cry, raising the knife as if it might protect him, though in his heart he knew the knife was useless, that this was far beyond steel or flesh, that he was already lost, and the only question left was what the thing inside his ear wanted and what those outside the door had come to take. The handle rattled, the door shook, and the slit in his ear tore wider with a wet ripping sound as though in anticipation, and he dropped the knife again, both hands flying to his head, screaming as the whispers became a roar and the boil finally burst open, releasing a torrent of fluid that splashed down his neck and chest, and from within something pale and segmented forced its way out, curling, twitching, dripping with his blood, and as his scream echoed through the small apartment the door slammed open and dark figures poured inside, their faces hidden, their hands reaching not for him but for the thing emerging from his flesh, and in that final moment before his vision went black he understood that he had never been alone, that from the first pulse of pain in his ear he had been marked, prepared, cultivated, and now the harvest had come. The fifth morning came with a heavy, suffocating quiet, as if the city outside the apartment had paused in anticipation of what had occurred the night before, and he awoke slumped against the bathroom floor, the residual warmth of the creature still clinging to his skin, the sticky blood and strange viscous fluid congealing along his neck and ear, a grotesque reminder that he was still tethered to what had emerged, and he slowly became aware that the apartment smelled different, no longer just of sweat and antiseptic, but a metallic tang mixed with a faint, underlying decay that seemed to pulse in the air itself. And the first thought in his mind was that he should flee, yet his body felt foreign, heavy, sluggish, as though the thing inside him had burrowed deeper, integrated itself into his nerves, and even his limbs felt alien, responding sluggishly, as if questioning his commands, and he struggled to his feet, staggering to the bedroom mirror, and what he saw made his stomach turn violently because the ear that had been torn open last night now looked even more unnatural, the skin swollen and discolored, faintly translucent, and underneath the surface, the pale segmented creature had retracted but left behind sinuous dark lines that wriggled under the skin like tiny living veins, alive, aware, and he could feel them moving, tugging at his muscles, twisting the shape of his ear canal, reshaping him from within, and the buzzing in his head had not ceased, now joined by intermittent whispers that seemed to anticipate his every thought, repeating fragments of his own fears back to him in distorted, hissing tones, and he staggered backward, knocking over a chair, and caught sight of his hands in the mirror. Pale, tremulous, nails bitten to the quick, skin mottled and slick, and his reflection no longer felt like him, a stranger staring back, yet every movement was mirrored, every expression copied, and he realized he could not tell where the human ended and the parasite began, and panic seized him in waves, yet he also felt a perverse fascination, a hypnotic curiosity that compelled him to touch the ear, to feel the wriggling beneath, and as soon as he did, a shiver ran through his spine, a deep resonance that vibrated in his bones, and he heard a low growl emanate not from the creature but from somewhere deep inside himself, as though the thing was now speaking through his chest, and he stumbled back into the living room, tripping over debris from the previous night's chaos, the apartment littered with broken glass, overturned chairs, and a small puddle of sticky fluid, and he realized he could no longer call it a boil. It was a host, a node, a growing sentient presence that had taken him as its incubator, and he remembered the shadows from the previous night, the figures who had entered when he was paralyzed in fear, and he wondered if they had been drawn by the emergence, if they had been waiting for this precise moment, the birth of something unspeakable, and then there was a knock, slow and deliberate, echoing through the apartment like a funeral drum, and he froze, hands shaking, breath caught in his throat, the whispers rising to a frenzy, urging him toward the door, warning him, taunting him. Yet he knew he could not resist, that whatever he did the figures outside were patient, inexorable, and the thing inside him seemed to guide his movements, compelling him forward, and when he reached the door, the knob turned under his hand as if it were already unlocked, and the door swung open to reveal the silhouettes from the night before, indistinct and featureless in the dim morning light, standing patiently, unmoving, and as he tried to retreat, the whispers converged into words that pierced his mind like needles. "It is time," they hissed, and a cold dread gripped his chest, yet in the same instant a flicker of hope appeared, a thought that perhaps they would help him, that this could be the salvation he had been seeking, and he extended his trembling hands toward them, the creature in his ear thrumming with anticipation. But as soon as his palms touched the air before the figures, the warmth and familiarity he imagined evaporated, replaced with a sensation of being pulled from within, a tug at his bones and nerves, and the whispers changed tone, urgent and mocking, almost joyous, and he felt a sudden surge of strength from the parasite, controlling his legs, forcing him to step forward into the waiting arms of the shadows, and then the floor beneath him seemed to ripple, the walls bending subtly, distorting, and he was no longer in the apartment as he knew it but in a warped version, a corridor of shadows and flickering light, echoing with the sound of his own name and the low, guttural hum of the creature that had emerged, and he realized with paralyzing clarity that this was a trial, a passage, and whether he survived would depend not on his courage or strength but on his submission to the entity within, and the figures did not speak, did not move, only extended hands, beckoning him to continue, and he walked, guided, the whispers now a constant presence, harmonizing with the throbbing in his ear, and with each step he felt more integrated, more hollowed, as if his human essence was being replaced, overwritten, yet still tethered, still screaming in silent resistance. And at the end of the corridor he saw a doorway, bright and pulsating, an unnatural light that called to the creature within him, and he hesitated, caught between instinctual fear and a strange, irresistible compulsion, and as he reached the threshold, the whispers crescendoed, commanding, joyous, anticipating the culmination of the transformation, and he realized that stepping through would mean surrendering fully, merging entirely with the thing that had made his body its host, leaving behind what little remained of his human self, and with a trembling breath he crossed the threshold, and immediately the corridor vanished, replaced by a blinding expanse of warmth and sensation, the creature thrumming through every nerve ending, expanding into him and beyond. And in that moment of total immersion he felt a fleeting, paradoxical relief, as if some part of him had been freed, yet a cold, creeping dread remained, for he knew that no matter what he had gained, what he had become, there was no escape, that the parasite had not just entered him, it had claimed him, and somewhere in the distance, he imagined, the shadowy figures waited, patient, watching, ensuring that the process was complete, and the last sensation before darkness overtook him was the whisper of his own name, soft and intimate, yet laden with an unfamiliar power, promising both continuation and torment, and he understood that even if he survived this trial, the transformation would not end, the presence inside would never relent, and he would never be alone again, not in his body, not in his mind, not in the world, and that was the new reality he would awaken to, if awakening was still possible. The final part dawned with a strange, almost deceptive calm, as if the city outside had learned to tiptoe around his presence, and he awoke lying on a surface that was neither his bed nor the bathroom floor, the sensation of the creature inside his ear fully integrated, a constant pulse vibrating through his skull, his muscles, his very bones, and for a moment he could not distinguish his own heartbeat from the rhythm of the entity within. The whispers had ceased, but a low, continuous hum filled his consciousness, soothing and terrifying simultaneously, and as he lifted his hands, they moved with a grace that was alien, precise, almost mechanical, skin mottled and glistening with remnants of past fluid, tiny dark veins visible beneath the surface, and he noticed the mirror across the room, not the familiar cracked, coffee-stained glass of his apartment, but a seamless, polished surface reflecting a figure that was both him and not him, pale, angular, with the ear grotesquely swollen yet smooth, the slit now healed over but faintly pulsing, as if breathing, and he reached toward it and felt no resistance, only the continuation of the strange internal connection, the hum vibrating in his chest as if welcoming him, and the room smelled faintly of metal, a coppery tang that reminded him of blood yet was clean, sterile, and everywhere he stepped, the floor seemed to flex subtly beneath his weight, shifting like liquid, guiding him toward an open archway that had not existed the night before, a threshold glowing with a soft, unnatural light that neither hurt nor comforted, drawing him forward irresistibly, and he walked, each step accompanied by a shiver that ran from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, and the whispers returned, not voices now but thought forms, impressions, urging him to understand that the creature had not just survived inside him, it had evolved with him, perfected, harmonized with his nervous system, and as he entered the archway, the world around him dissolved into a vertiginous expanse of color, movement, sensation, where time seemed to stretch and fold, and he felt the presence inside expand, probing, exploring, merging further, and he realized with a clarity that was both awe-inspiring and horrifying that he could no longer distinguish his thoughts from the entities, his memories from its experience, and yet, paradoxically, he retained an awareness of self, a tiny shard of resistance that whispered, human, and fragile, that he had not yet been fully consumed, and then he saw them, the figures from the previous nights, standing in the distance, silent, featureless, observing, and he understood that they were neither enemies nor allies, only witnesses to the final integration, and a shudder ran through him, because even as the entity pulsed and writhed in his ear, communicating, harmonizing, expanding, he felt a creeping sense of dread that this was not the end, that the transformation was a beginning of something he could not anticipate, and the environment around him shifted again, revealing multiple paths, each shimmering and impossible, some leading back to places familiar yet warped, others to unknown expanses, and instinctively he knew that each path would test him, would challenge the fragile boundary between human and other, between self and parasite, and the hum in his chest crescendoed, vibrating through every fiber of his being, and then, from deep within, the sensation of something budding, new growth, another pulse, and he realized with horror and fascination that the creature had reproduced, a smaller knot forming beneath the surface of his jaw, subtle but undeniably present, and he could feel it moving, testing, exploring the connection to his nervous system, and with that, the whispers returned, soft but insistent, repeating his name and other sounds he could not understand, a litany of life and presence, and he understood that no matter what path he took, no matter how much he resisted or accepted, the process had only begun, that his body was no longer his own but a vessel, a conduit, a hybrid of flesh and something ineffable, and the archway pulsed, a living heartbeat of light, and he stepped forward, feeling the small knot in his jaw synchronize with the pulse in his ear, feeling both dread and a perverse exhilaration, and he realized that he could never return to his apartment, to the world as he knew it, that even if he survived, even if The integration continued peacefully. He would never feel entirely human again, never experience the solitude or comfort of being a singular self, and yet there was no resistance left in his limbs, no fear strong enough to oppose the internal harmony, and as the light of the archway enveloped him completely, the hum becoming a resonant symphony through his body, he felt a fleeting clarity, a connection to something greater, and for an instant, a fragment of joy, of release, of transcendence. Before the awareness returned that even in this vast expanse, the creature, the transformation, and the consequences were ongoing, unending, and somewhere, in the deep recesses of his mind and body, he sensed another pulse, another whisper, another emergence, and with that understanding, he realized that the story was not ending, that survival was no longer defined by escaping, healing, or resisting, but by enduring, adapting, merging, and continuing within a reality that had shifted irrevocably, and as he floated in the expanse, feeling every vibration, every movement of the integrated creature, and sensing the distant observation of the shadowy figures, he knew that he would awaken again, transformed yet whole, tethered yet free, and that somewhere, perhaps in a mirror, perhaps in the echo of a whisper, he would always hear the pulse, always feel the subtle twitching, and always remember that the journey was eternal, the transformation incomplete, and that the creature inside was not finished, nor ever would be, leaving him suspended in a liminal space of dread, awe, and perpetual anticipation.